The station wagon hadn't even left the driveway before your mother lit a cigarette, and your little brother tumbled into the cargo area without a seatbelt. Nobody said a word. That was Tuesday. Here are 30 strange 1970s parenting rules that made absolutely no sense. Station wagons were the family vehicles of the 1970s, and the back cargo area, the flat space behind the rear seat, was understood by every kid who ever climbed into one to be the best seat in the house. No seat, no seat belt, no nothing. You stretched out on the floor back there, or you sat up facing backward, watching the road disappear behind you, or you piled in with 3 siblings and a dog and someone's baseball equipment and went wherever the family was going. The first federal motor vehicle safety standard requiring seat belts for all seating positions did not come until the NHTSA standard took effect in 1970. Tennessee became the first state to pass a child restraint law in 1978. All 50 states did not have one until 1986. In the years before those laws, the physics of the cargo area were what they always had been. In a sudden stop, every unsecured object in that space, including your child, continued forward at the speed the car had been traveling. Your father smoked Marlboros. Your mother preferred Virginia Slims. On long drives, both of them might be going at once, windows cracked an inch or two because it was cold, the lighter clicking in the front seat somewhere between Toledo and wherever you were heading. The car was a sealed metal box. The windows let out almost nothing. Philip Morris commissioned an internal study in 1978, and its own researchers described it as identifying secondhand smoke as the most dangerous development to the industry's viability. That language was that blunt, that early, in a document that stayed internal for decades until it was produced in U.S. versus Philip Morris. The Surgeon General did not issue a specific advisory on secondhand smoke until June of 1982. Until then, lighting up in the car with the kids in the back was not a warning on any label, not a concern in any parenting book, and not something anyone told your parents to stop. Long before the formal ban, lawn darts were in garages across America. The standard Jart set, a heavy cardboard box, 4 steel-tipped projectiles, each weighing more than a pound, and 2 plastic rings for the grass. The game itself was simple enough. You stood behind one ring and threw the dart high into the air, arcing it down toward the other ring 15 or 20 feet away. The problems arrived when the arc was wrong. The steel tip was a spike, tapered to a point, hardened specifically to stick in the ground on impact. When it did not hit the ground, it hit whatever was underneath its descent path. The CPSC tracked emergency room visits from lawn dart injuries beginning in the late 1970s and counted more than 6,000 over a 10-year period. 3 of the people killed were children. The product remained on shelves through all of it. The ban came in December of 1988, which was not 1972, not 1978, not 1983. Aspirin was the universal parenting response to a child's fever in the 1970s. Bayer Children's aspirin came in an orange-flavored chewable tablet, sweet enough that kids asked for it. It was in every medicine cabinet. Doctors recommended it. The connection between aspirin use in children with viral illnesses, particularly influenza and chickenpox, and a rare but fatal condition called Reyes syndrome had been suspected in medical literature as early as 1965. By 1973, the CDC had begun active surveillance. Between 1979 and 1980, there were 555 confirmed cases with a fatality rate of 31%. The Surgeon General issued a public advisory specifically warning against giving aspirin to children with viral illnesses in June of 1982. Warning labels were not required on aspirin products until 1986. For a full decade after the link was established, the orange chewable tablets stayed in the cabinet and parents kept reaching for them. But the dangers inside the house were matched, step for step, by the ones outside it. The playground at the end of the block was built from steel, climbing frames, merry-go-rounds, and slides that faced south, and spent summer days absorbing direct sunlight until the surface could raise a blister through denim. The ground underneath was asphalt or compacted gravel, and in many schoolyards it was bare concrete. There were no federal safety standards for public playground equipment in the 1970s. The CPSC issued its first voluntary guidelines in 1981, but they were voluntary. The steel structures themselves were not the only hazard. The spinning merry-go-round had no guard to prevent a child's foot from going under the frame while it rotated, and the exposed bolt ends on climbing equipment were standard hardware, the same kind used in industrial construction. The distance from the top of the slide to the ground was whatever the original installer had decided, which was often 8 to 10 feet over asphalt. The be home by dark rule was not really a rule. It was the outer boundary of a management strategy. You left the house in the morning. You went wherever. You were expected to return when the light changed. In between, there was no check-in, no phone call, no way for your parents to know whether you were at the creek or the vacant lot or the drainage ditch behind the shopping center where everyone went to smoke cigarettes and throw rocks at things. This was not considered neglect. It was considered a childhood. By the early 1990s, surveys found that roughly 7% of American children between the ages of 5 and 13 regularly spent time home alone or unsupervised after school, a figure that represented the declining end of a peak that had been significantly higher through the 1970s. There were no minimum age laws in most states. There was no Child Protective Services framework that defined unsupervised children as a reportable condition. The rule was, be back by dark. The beach protocol in the 1970s was straightforward. You applied copper tone, which came in SPF 2 at its strongest formulation, or you applied nothing. Or, if you were serious about it, you mixed baby oil with a few drops of iodine and covered yourself in that, because the iodine was said to deepen the tan, and the oil ensured that no incoming ultraviolet light was filtered, scattered, or in any way impeded on its path to your skin. Parents did this to their children. They did it to themselves. The University of Utah Health has documented that a single blistering sunburn during childhood doubles the lifetime risk of melanoma. The Skin Cancer Foundation puts childhood exposure as one of the primary drivers of later skin cancer development. In the 1970s, the cultural consensus was that a tan was a sign of health, that kids who ran brown all summer were thriving, and that SPF 2 was something you used if you burned easily, not something everyone needed. The garden hose was a summer fixture in every American yard. You drank from it after running around. You filled the kiddie pool with it. You held your thumb over the end to spray your siblings with it. Nobody asked what was in it. The answer was more than water. Garden hoses in the 1970s were manufactured with lead stabilizers in the polyvinyl chloride, antimony compounds, and phthalate plasticizers. None of those were food-safe materials. All of them leached into the water sitting in the warm rubber tube between uses. The Food and Drug Administration had no jurisdiction over garden hoses. No federal regulation required that hoses used for drinking water be tested or labeled. The label drinking water safe on modern hoses reflects a voluntary standard that some manufacturers adopted decades later. For the 1970s, the hose was the hose. The kids drank from it, and nobody was checking what came out the other end. The key was on a string around your neck or in the front pocket of your backpack, and you did not lose it because losing it meant standing on the front steps for 3 hours. The Latchkey System operated on the assumption that a child old enough to carry a key was old enough to let themselves in, heat something on the stove, and manage the afternoon until a parent came home from work. In the 1970s, this was not considered a child welfare issue. It was considered practical. There were no minimum age requirements in most states for leaving a child alone at home. There was no standardized CPS framework that categorized unsupervised elementary-age children as a reportable situation. The research that later connected chronic unsupervised time to elevated anxiety, higher rates of early substance use, and developmental risk had not moved from journals into policy. The key went around the neck, and the system worked until it did not. The medicine cabinet in most American bathrooms of the 1970s was a metal box above the sink, spring-latched, and accessible to anyone tall enough to reach it, which, if you left a stool nearby, included children as young as 3. Aspirin was in there in a bottle that opened by pushing down and turning, or in some older formulations, by just turning. Prescription bottles were whatever the pharmacy had put them in. Sleeping pills, antihistamines, cough syrups with codeine, all of it at the same height, behind the same mirror, in the same unlocked cabinet. The Poison Prevention Packaging Act, which required child-resistant closures on hazardous substances, passed in 1970 and took effect in 1972. The rate of accidental pediatric poisoning dropped significantly in the years that followed. Before the act, poison control centers across the country were fielding thousands of calls annually about children who had accessed household medications. The cabinet was open. The bottles were within reach. The National Lead Company marketed its Dutch Boy paint to American families for more than 50 years. For much of that time, the marketing was direct. Dutch Boy was clean. Dutch Boy was bright. Dutch Boy was the right paint for your children's room. Lead carbonate gave the paint its vivid white color and its durability. It also gave the paint its sweetness. Lead tastes sweet. That is why children who found flaking paint on windowsills and baseboards put it in their mouths. Pediatricians began seeing elevated blood lead levels in urban children with reliable consistency through the 1960s and 70s. Children absorb 4 to 5 times more lead from ingestion than adults do. The CPSC banned lead in children's toys and furniture in 1973. The ban on lead in residential paint did not come until 1978. In the years between those two dates, and in all the years before, the paint was on the walls of nurseries across the country, and it was peeling. Long before any state thought to regulate it, riding in the open bed of a pickup truck was a standard American childhood experience. You climbed over the tailgate, you sat on the metal bed or on a cooler, and the truck moved. Wind, road noise, the smell of whatever the last load had been, and the sensation of being outside on a highway at 60 miles an hour with nothing between you and the air. The cargo bed of a pickup truck had no seat belts, no walls above the side rails, and no restraint of any kind. In the event of a sudden stop or a collision, the primary mechanism of injury was ejection. The occupant continued forward and left the vehicle. No federal law restricted children from riding in open truck beds in the 1970s. States began passing laws in the 1980s and the 1990s, piecemeal, with different age restrictions and penalty structures. Some states still have no restriction today. Chemistry sets sold to children in the 1970s were not the baking soda and vinegar kits that line toy shelves today. The popular sets from manufacturers like Gilbert and Chemcraft included potassium permanganate, sodium ferrocyanide, ammonium chloride, and cobalt chloride, compounds that could produce smoke, react violently with other household chemicals, and in some cases burn through skin on contact. The alcohol lamps used to heat experiments were open flame devices with no shut-off. The glass beakers were real laboratory glass. The instruction manuals included experiments that escalated in chemical hazard from the first page to the last, written on the assumption that children had the judgment to stop before the dangerous ones. Many did not. The Consumer Product Safety Commission began restricting the most hazardous compounds from children's chemistry sets in the early 1980s after years of injury reports. For the entire 1970s, a 12-year-old with $20 and a Sears catalog could order a kit containing more reactive chemicals than most school science departments kept on their shelves. Spanking was not a controversial parenting decision in the 1970s. It was the default. The belt, the wooden spoon, the open hand were not considered abuse. They were considered consequences. A New Zealand study covering the 1970s and 80s found that 80% of the sampled population reported corporal punishment from parents at some point during childhood. American schools maintain paddle policies in many states, with principals keeping wooden paddles in their offices as standard equipment. The American Academy of Pediatrics did not officially recommend against spanking until 1998. What research accumulating through the decades showed, quietly in journals that did not reach kitchen tables, was that children who were spanked regularly showed elevated rates of aggression and increased anxiety compared to children disciplined non-physically. None of that reached parents in the 1970s. The rule was clear, backed by every generation before it, practiced across most of the country without hesitation. It was also, the research eventually confirmed, wrong. Few people today remember that riding on the outside of a moving car, on the hood, the roof, the open trunk lid, was a recognizable activity in the 1970s neighborhoods, not a stunt, but a casual occurrence. A teenager on the hood while a friend drove slowly through a parking lot. A group of kids on the roof of a station wagon heading home from the beach. The trunk propped open with someone's legs dangling out. There were no federal laws specifically prohibiting children from riding on a vehicle's exterior in this era. Most traffic codes addressed restraint inside the vehicle, not outside it. The physics were straightforward. Any sudden stop, turn, or road imperfection would launch an exterior rider forward or sideways with nothing between them and asphalt. The rule in most households was not a rule. It was, at most, a vague discomfort that nobody ever converted into an instruction. Wood-burning kits were sold as children's art supplies throughout the 1970s, marketed under names like Pyro Art and Craft Tool. The centerpiece of each kit was a solid metal stylus that heated to about 750 degrees Fahrenheit when plugged in. Hot safety instructions in most kits consisted of one line. It said, "Do not touch the metal tip." There was no heat-resistant stand to rest the tool on between uses, so it sat on whatever surface was nearest, radiating heat continuously until unplugged. There was no automatic shutoff. There was no cool touch grip beyond a few inches from the tip. There was no age restriction on the packaging. Kits were sold for children as young as 8 and appeared in school craft curricula across the country. Parents set them up on the kitchen table and left. The smell of burning wood filling a Sunday afternoon was the smell of a tool so hot it sat inches from a child's face with nobody watching. The tool was never recalled. It is still sold today, largely unchanged. Candy cigarettes came in 2 varieties in the 1970s. One was a chalky sugar stick wrapped in white paper with a red dyed tip. The other was a bubblegum version pressed into cigarette shape and sold in a box designed to look exactly like a pack of Marlboros or Camels, with the same fonts, the same color scheme, and the same flip-top lid. The packaging was almost identical to real cigarette packs. Children bought them at the corner store and walked home holding them between 2 fingers. They lifted them to their lips and blew powdered sugar meant to simulate smoke. Pediatric researchers who raised concerns in the 1970s said the product normalized the physical gestures and social rituals of smoking. Their warnings were largely dismissed. Studies conducted later found that children who consumed candy cigarettes were more likely to become adult smokers than those who had not. The product was never federally banned in the United States. It remains legal today. You can still buy them in packaging nearly identical to the original at novelty stores and online. Before stranger danger entered public consciousness in the early 1980s, the rule for a young child's errand was simple. Here is the money. Here is what to get. Here is the way back. 5- and 6-year-olds walked to the corner store alone, to the pharmacy alone, to the neighbor 3 streets over alone. The system assumed a neighborhood functionally supervised by its collective adult presence. Someone always on a porch, always in a yard, always visible. In most post-war American neighborhoods, that assumption was roughly accurate. By the mid-1970s, as more mothers entered the workforce and the dense social fabric of those communities thinned, the assumption held even as the reality shifted underneath it. The first major national child safety campaign that specifically addressed unaccompanied errand running did not launch until 1984, following the high-profile abductions that defined that era. Until then, the 5-year-old with a dollar bill and a mission was a completely unremarkable sight. If you grew up in an American city or suburb in the 1970s, you breathed leaded gasoline exhaust every single day. Peak leaded gasoline use in the United States occurred in the late 1970s, and the exhaust dispersed lead particles into the air at every intersection, every school drop-off, every yard adjacent to a busy road. Lead from vehicle exhaust settled into soil, into windowsill dust, into homes with open windows near traffic. The EPA began phasing out leaded gasoline in 1973, but full elimination did not complete until 1996. Researchers now estimate that roughly half the entire United States population was exposed to meaningfully harmful lead levels in early childhood, primarily through car exhaust. A study published in 2000 found that lead exposure explained 65 to 90% of the variation in violent crime rates across American cities in the decades that followed. Your parents did not know they were doing this to you. Nobody told them there was a choice. The tobacco industry ran a campaign for years in which physicians appeared in advertisements recommending cigarette brands to their patients. By the early 1970s, that practice had faded from mainstream advertising, but the cultural residue, the idea that cigarettes were at worst a neutral adult habit, carried directly into household parenting. A 1974 industry meeting in Bermuda coined the term environmental tobacco smoke as part of a coordinated effort to frame secondhand smoke as a scientific controversy rather than a documented hazard. The industry had its own internal research. Documents produced in litigation later showed that tobacco companies had concluded well before the mid-1970s that children in smoking households developed smaller lung capacity and higher rates of respiratory illness. They did not publish those findings. They funded studies designed to reach other conclusions. The parents who smoked at the dinner table and in the closed car were not reckless people. They had been deliberately and systematically lied to by the companies that sold them the cigarettes. The family garage or workshop in the 1970s was not a child-proofed space. It was an unguarded room containing a table saw with an exposed blade, an electric drill, open cans of turpentine and mineral spirits on a shelf, and a workbench at exactly the height a 3-year-old could reach by dragging over a stool. The parenting rule was the same for most hazardous spaces in this era. The child was told not to touch things, and the adult assumed the instruction would be followed. OSHA had no jurisdiction over private residences. Power tools manufactured in the 1970s often had blade guards removed because the guards interfered with visibility. Many machines had exposed wiring, and moving parts lacked automatic shutoffs. In theory, the toddler who wandered in was supervised. In practice, the child was a few feet from a dangerous blade and a shelf of open solvents, and nobody was watching. One reason so few children wore bicycle helmets in the 1970s is that no helmet specifically designed for cyclists existed until that decade, and even then the designs were rudimentary, uncomfortable, and worn almost exclusively by competitive racers. Helmets were what the Tour de France used. Regular kids did not wear them. Children rode miles from home, built ramps from plywood and cinder blocks, rode downhill on roads with no shoulder, treated traffic laws as approximate suggestions, and did all of it with nothing between their skulls and the pavement. The first mandatory bicycle helmet law for children in the United States did not appear until 1987 in California. Today, mandatory helmet laws for minors are in place in 21 states and the District of Columbia. In the 1970s, social enforcement ran the other direction entirely. A kid who showed up to the neighborhood ride wearing a helmet was looked at as someone with a condition, not someone with a sensible parent. The peer pressure was against protection. Baby walkers were sold as developmental tools throughout the 1970s. The idea being that putting a pre-walking infant into a wheeled frame and letting them scoot across the floor would strengthen their legs and accelerate learning to walk. Pediatricians largely endorsed them. Johnson & Johnson advertised them. The American Academy of Pediatrics did not reverse its position and formally oppose baby walkers until 1993. What the walkers actually did was give a child who could not yet walk the ability to travel at speeds of up to 3 feet per second toward staircases, pools, hot ovens, or any hazards at floor level. The CPSC found that by the early 1990s, more than 20,000 infants per year were treated in emergency rooms for walker-related injuries, the majority from falls downstairs. Canada banned the sale of baby walkers entirely in 2004. The United States never did. DDT was sprayed directly onto children in the 1950s and the early 1960s as a routine public health measure. Truck-mounted foggers moved through neighborhoods, releasing thick clouds of the pesticide while kids ran behind them in the summer heat. By the early 1970s, DDT was no longer used that way, but it had not gone anywhere. It was still present in the soil, in the food chain, and in household pesticide products under American sinks. The EPA banned agricultural uses of DDT in 1972 after Rachel Carson's 1962 book Silent Spring had spent a decade forcing the science into public view. What the ban did not address was the body burden already accumulated. DDT and its breakdown compound. DDE remained detected in the breast milk of American mothers throughout the 1970s, transferred directly to nursing infants. Studies later linked early DDT exposure to elevated breast cancer risk and to disrupted hormonal development in the children who carried it. If DDT was an invisible poison passed through breast milk, lawn darts were a danger sold openly at toy counters with box art of a sunny afternoon. Jarts, steel-tipped projectiles each roughly a foot long and weighing over a pound, were designed to be thrown high into the air toward a target ring on the ground. They were sold as a family yard game in hardware stores throughout the 1970s. Between 1978 and 1988, Jarts sent more than 6,000 people to emergency rooms. 3 of those people were children who died. Michelle Snow, age 7, was struck in the head by a Jart thrown by her brother in Riverside, California, in 1987. Her father, David Snow, spent the following year petitioning the CPSC with every news clipping he could find documenting children harmed by the product. The CPSC banned lawn darts on December 19, 1988. The company had been told of the deaths, and they had not changed the design, issued a recall, or added a warning. Before the Poison Prevention Packaging Act took effect in 1972, the pill bottles in your parents' medicine cabinet opened with a simple push and turn, or just a push, or in many cases, just a pull. Aspirin bottles, sleeping pill bottles, prescription bottles, all designed for adult convenience, with nothing to slow down a 3-year-old. The packaging standard requiring child-resistant closures was not proposed until 1970, after years of poisoning statistics accumulated at pediatric hospitals. From 1959 to 1969, accidental poisoning was one of the leading causes of injury death in American children under 5. The act passed, the child-resistant caps went on, and pediatric poisoning deaths dropped by more than 45% within a decade. The caps were not a technological challenge, they were a priority nobody had made. For nearly 20 years of the post-war boom, the solution sat unused while the statistics climbed. In cities across America throughout the 1970s, apartment windows opened onto whatever was beyond them, a fire escape, a ledge, a drop of 4 or 12 stories, and the only thing between a toddler and that drop was a screen designed to keep insects out. Window screens were not structural. They were thin aluminum mesh held in a light frame, offering no real resistance to a child leaning into them. New York City began requiring window guards in 1976 after a city study found children were falling from windows at more than 1 per day during summer months. No federal standard for residential window guards existed anywhere in this era. Outside New York, the apartment window remained exactly what it had always been, a hole in the wall and nothing solid between a child and the drop below. Asbestos was applied to the ceilings, floors, pipes, and structural beams of American schools from the 1940s through the early 1970s as a standard fireproofing material. Evidence linking it to mesothelioma had been accumulating in occupational health literature since the 1930s. The asbestos industry suppressed studies and framed lung disease in workers as a labor problem rather than a product liability for decades. The law requiring schools to inspect for asbestos and develop management plans was not passed until 1986. In every year between construction and that law, millions of kids sat under deteriorating asbestos ceilings every school day, and no one was required to say a word to their parents. The first federal safety standard for infant car seats took effect in 1971, but it addressed only structural integrity, not whether the seat would actually protect a child in a crash. Consumer Reports tested infant carriers sold in the early 1970s and found that most performed so poorly in crash simulations that they would have worsened the outcome. The seats faced forward, the harnesses were loose, and the frames were not built to absorb impact. Tennessee became the first state to require child passenger restraints in 1978. 32 states had no such law by 1980. The leading cause of injury death in American kids under 5 during those years was motor vehicle accidents. The technology existed, nobody required it. What is hardest to sit with, looking back at the 1970s, is not the products themselves. It is the trust. Your parents were not negligent people who ignored warnings. Most of them had no warnings to ignore. The companies that sold lead paint marketed it as the safe, clean choice for nurseries. The asbestos manufacturers called their tiles durable and fireproof and never mentioned the fibers. The pharmaceutical companies that sold aspirin for feverish kids had lobbied to keep the Reyes syndrome warning off the label. The regulatory agencies, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the Food and Drug Administration, and the Environmental Protection Agency were new, underfunded, and in many cases captured by the industries they were meant to oversee. The families of the 1970s did what every generation does. They used the products they were sold, followed the advice they were given, and trusted that someone had checked. In case after case, nobody had. They trusted the label. If this made you angry enough to share it, that is exactly the right reaction.